Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. Our guest today is Dr. Christopher McIntosh, who is an author and scholar of the Western esoteric tradition. Dr. McIntosh was born in England in 1943 and grew up in Edinburgh, Scotland. He studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford and German at London University, later returning to Oxford to take a doctorate in history with a dissertation on the Rosicrucian movement. After working in London in journalism and publishing, he spent 4 years in New York as an information officer with the United Nations Development Program, then moved to Germany to work for UNESCO. In parallel, he has pursued a career as a writer and researcher, specializing in the esoteric traditions as well as nature-oriented belief systems. He has lectured widely and was on the faculty of the Distance MA program in Western Esotericism at the University of Exeter, England, now sadly discontinued. He is married to the scholar of religion, Dr. Donate Panke McIntosh, and lives in North Germany. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you, Kirk. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, glad to have you on the program. I know some listeners might be curious as to why I'm looking into the Western esoteric tradition, as it seems divorced from sort of politics and the social changes that most people talk about. But as I think we'll discover in our conversation, there's probably a lot of connections that people aren't aware of. Would you agree?
I would agree, yes.
Yes. But I like to start off with a little sort of icebreaker in a way, where I'd like to ask you, since the theme of this program is independent thought and freedom, who is your favorite independent thinker of all time?
Well, there have been various thinkers who have influenced me at different periods in my life. But if I were to point to one individual, I would say the Scottish poet and artist Ian Hamilton Finlay. He was famous for a wonderful garden that he created with his wife in the Pentland Hills near Edinburgh. And the garden was filled, well, it still exists, although he is long since died. The garden is filled with his works of art, sculptures, inscriptions on stone, poems, visual puns, many of these things referring to the classical tradition and classical mythology. Now, the interesting thing about him was that he was both a sort of avant-garde artist and a kind of radical traditionalist. And I think what he taught me really was that tradition is not something like a chain that holds you down. It's an accumulation of experience from the past, which guides you in the present and helps you to live a reasonable life. He steered me in the direction, in a similar direction. His garden, his whole property was in fact dedicated to the god Apollo. So he was in a way a sort of pagan, although he wouldn't have described himself as such. He also turned me on to gardening, and I've also created a number of gardens in my life, and I've tried to apply some of the same principles that he applied. And one of my books is called Gardens of the Gods, which is a study of sacred and symbolic gardens in different traditions.
Well, what in your view was the independent sort of nature of his thinking or action or being? What was it? Making that garden itself? Was that act that you are?
Well, it was more than just making the garden. The garden, as I said, was dedicated to Apollo, and yes, he had a building in the grounds that was both an art gallery and a temple to Apollo. and it had an inscription to Apollo over the doorway. And at one point, the local authority came after him for taxes, local taxes on this building. And he said, no, this is a temple, it's a religious building, so it's exempt from taxes. And they said, well, but a temple to Apollo is not a religious building, we don't recognize that. So he carried out a long, long battle with the local authority over this issue. And he took the view, in a civilized country, a temple to Apollo should be recognized as a religious building. So he was standing up for the classical tradition, you see.
Yes.
And he turned this battle into, he gave it a great symbolic significance, because it was part of his whole philosophy. That
did he win?
Well, in the end, yeah. In the end, it was a kind of stalemate. But
okay.
In effect, the local authority gave in.
Right. Well, that's interesting, because we can return to some of those themes and how it fits in the nature of the discussion. But for the listeners, can you please describe your work?
Yeah. Well, I would describe myself as a writer, as you said, on subjects like mythology, folklore, alternative spirituality, and the esoteric. And I'm also a writer of fiction, and most of my recent writing has been, in one way or another, connected with paganism. So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, right. And you've been writing on this since when? When would you say?
Well, I've been writing on esoteric subjects since my mid-20s.
Right.
On paganism more recently.
Right. Would maybe some people may not be familiar with the term esoteric. Could you describe that for the layperson? I know it's related to the Hermetic tradition, and cult.
Yes, well,
cult itself means hidden. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the term esoteric covers a multitude of sins. Esotericism is basically all those traditions which in the past have been marginalized by mainstream learning. Things like, as you say, Hermeticism, alchemy, Kabbalah, astrology, things like that.
Right, right.
And these things, over time, these areas have become recognized as having had an important influence on Western culture. And so increasingly there are now departments in universities that are studying these things. I became interested in this area before there was much academic interest in it. So in a way, I was one of the pioneers of serious study in this area.
Would that be from the 1960s or later?
Yes. My first book was published in 1969. That was a book on astrology. Right.
Good. And what is your goal in doing this? For instance, do you want to say convert European peoples from Christianity to paganism, or discover their roots? Or what is?
No, heaven forbid. I don't want to convert anybody. I don't want to be an evangelist for paganism and persuade people to become born again pagans. Pagans don't proselytize, which is why they don't fight over religion. They may fight over other things like territory, but never over religion, unless, of course, they're threatened with forced conversion, which they were during the period of Christianization. So, no, I don't want to proselytize for paganism.
Right. Yeah, but I know the first time I sort of came across this subject seriously, it was probably reading Nietzsche, and And then I can't remember what book it might have been. I don't know if it was The Genealogy of Morals. I don't know if it was another one of his works. But I started to understand and it was through Camille Paglia in the 1990s that I was introduced.
Yeah.
And so she was talking about the whole importance of paganism to the Western artistic tradition, and she pointed to Nietzsche but I got a sense from Nietzsche and the German Romantics that it was about really rooting oneself in one's ancient past, and so you could see how it was very much related to nationalism and national pride and all this sort of thing like that. Was that a motivation for you at all?
Well, I prefer the word local to national.
Right.
The link, the sort of romantic nationalist type of paganism was really an invention of the 19th century, the Romantic period.
Yeah.
But paganism to me is a local. It's something rooted in local traditions, and it doesn't have much to do with national boundaries. More with local.
Right. National boundaries are certainly new as opposed to
that's right. Yes.
Traditions.
Yes. So it's sometimes difficult to separate what is strictly speaking pagan from local folk traditions, folklore.
Yes.
And very often they're bound up together. I live in North Germany. I live in an area of North Germany that speaks Low German, Plattdeutsch. So I'm taking the trouble to learn Low German and also to learn North German folk songs and North German dances and so on. It's all to me. It's all mixed up together.
Right. Yeah. And how is that related to the English language? Because English is Anglish from the Angles and.
Oh yes. Well, the Angles originally came from this part of the world, actually.
Yes.
So there's a connection there, and Low German is very closely related to English. Much of the vocabulary is the same as English.
Right. Yeah. And I understand like Frisian, which is some sort of Germanic language simplified. Some sentences read exactly like English. They may be pronounced differently, but they read the same.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Now, let me ask you, in your view, why is paganism relevant today at all? Because, I mean, maybe some people might think of it as, some weird hippie new age type of thing. What's your...
Well, yes, it's true. For many people, it is a weird new age thing, but that's changing. In a number of countries, paganism is now officially established. For example, in Iceland. It started in Iceland in the 1970s, and it's now one of the official religions of the country, with over 4,000 members. And those members include university professors, journalists, writers, politicians, and so on. In other words, it's not a particularly weird or new age membership. It's a fairly mainstream sort of membership. And similar things are happening in other countries.
I mean, you'll know that elsewhere in the world, obviously, the term pagan is, I mean, maybe from its founding, I mean, it's infused with the negative aspects from Christianity. I mean,
exactly.
Because I think the word itself is probably from the Christian tradition describing the non-Jewish, non-Christian tradition. Because people who call themselves pagan today, I mean, that wouldn't be the the term they would have called themselves.
No, well, I think it's a term that originated with the Romans, actually, and I think a pagan meant something like a country dweller.
Okay. Oh, so that's what I was always trying to find. So it means sort of like the rural tradition, the rural folk.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And the word heathen has a similar meaning. Heathen means basically a heath dweller, somebody who dwells on the heath.
Ah, I never made the connection between the heath
Yeah,
and heathen.
yeah. And in Germany, the word heathen, Heider, to most people means a non-believer, an atheist.
Ah.
So it's only recently that it's taken on the meaning of somebody who believes in the old gods.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Yeah. But as I was saying, paganism gradually becoming established in various countries. In Britain, for example, there are now something like 70,000 people who describe themselves as pagans, according to the latest census. And there are prison visitors, pagan hospital visitors. There's even a pagan police federation. And you can declare yourself a pagan on various official forms. So it's gradually getting established. And you ask why it's relevant today.
Yeah.
Well, it accords rather well with many aspects of the modern world. You take the ecology movement, for example. Paganism is a nature-oriented religion. So it stands to reason that pagans would espouse environmental causes. Then there's the feminist movement. In paganism, there isn't one patriarchal god. There are gods and goddesses and priests and priestesses. So again, it stands to reason that it would appeal to feminists. And also it accords with certain trends in modern psychology. For example, the American psychologist, the late James Hillman, argued that polytheism provides a much better basis for dealing with the human psyche than monotheism because of the complexity of the human psyche, the way that it's composed of a multiplicity of different elements, different drives, emotions, fears, and so on. And Hillman recommended working with these as though they were gods. And he's also been reported as saying that the gods are not dead. They're alive and well on the corner of Broadway and 42nd Street, waiting for the lights to change. Well, I think what he meant was that the gods have adjusted very well to the modern world. When you think of the internet is in a way the ideal medium for paganism because it gives a voice to even tiny groups, and it enables pagans all over the world to communicate with each other and have a sense of community.
And you know, I'm wondering if he's referring to Broadway, the theaters, because this is precisely Camille Paglia's argument that the theater, the visual arts, the musical arts are inherently pagan, which is interesting because in the United States, especially, the Baptists and the sort of Protestant Christians, Calvinists and so forth, very, very much against that and calling it pagan, meaning satanic, evil. But the thing is that they might be onto something in the sense that it's referring to a very different tradition that is much more visual and visceral in some ways, quite different from particularly Protestant Puritanism, which is their critique of Catholicism as well.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I haven't read a great deal of Camille Paglia's work, but from what I have read, I think she correctly perceives that paganism has been continually present as a sort of undercurrent in Western culture, and it has manifested itself in the arts as well as in other ways. And now it's bursting out everywhere in popular culture.
Yeah.
And she's an interesting example of how a number of intellectuals in the present day are becoming apologists for paganism. And another example is the French philosopher Alain de Benoit. Alain de Benoit. And there are a number of, for example, Jungian psychotherapists who are pagans.
Now, I want to ask it to bring it into a little bit more what they say politics aspect.
Yeah.
How does your current work with Western esotericism tie in with your earlier work with the UNDP? Do you see any link, or was it totally separate for you?
Well, my decision to go and work for UNDP had in fact nothing to do with esotericism,
right,
or paganism. But my experience at UNDP was important for my journey towards paganism.
And why is that?
Well, UNDP has what I would call a globalist agenda, whereas paganism, as I said, tends to be rooted in the local.
That's right.
Now,
so you were observing this when, in the 60s, 70s, 80s? What?
Well, I was at UNDP from 1989 to 1993.
Okay, during the fall of the Soviet Union, and yeah.
Exactly, yes. So at UNDP, I saw the problems that are associated with the globalist agenda, as well as some of the positive aspects.
Yes.
But in the UN system, there was a slogan that people were fond of repeating, which was "Think global, act local."
Yes.
And think local, act global.
Right.
Well, the trouble was that the global agenda tended to predominate with its god of economic growth. Now, the god of economic growth is a jealous god, you could say,
yeah,
who crushes any rivals that stands in his way. A typical example of that is the way in which the sacred lands of the Native Americans have been violated to make way for commercial interests, because the agenda of economic growth just doesn't have any place for things like sacred lands and sacred sites. And this has been proved time and time again in many parts of the world.
Well, what sort of work were you doing with the UNDP?
I was editor of a magazine on development issues. So I was traveling all over the world reporting on development projects.
Because at that time, I should tell you, I mean, I was actually doing my master's and was finishing up my first degree, and it was in international development studies. And my master's was in development studies. So I was very much tied up into all that, and that was sort of my scholastic base in terms of university training. So I can visualize and sympathize with a lot of the things you're talking about. I was involved in a lot of those issues.
So did you come to similar conclusions?
Yes, absolutely. Very, very much so. I mean, we can discuss my epiphany moment in it, but I'd like to discuss yours first, and then we can compare notes, so to speak. But because I'm trying to get what your motivation was to join the UNDP. Was it simply as a job, and it wasn't necessarily a calling as such?
I'm afraid it was for very mundane reasons.
Right.
I arrived in New York in 1989, and I needed a job, and I had experience as a journalist, and I was lucky enough to apply to the UNDP at a time when they were looking for journalists and editors.
Right.
So they took me on, and it was a great time. It was a wonderful place to work. The whole UN was a wonderful place to work. I had great colleagues, and I have very happy memories of the job, despite my reservations about the development.
So was it like a particular issue, like say perhaps building on Native American holy sites, that sort of turned you off? Was it something like that, a particular issue?
No, it was just a gradual realization of the problems involved in development, in the whole development agenda. I mean, I'm not against certain aspects of the international development system. I mean, I think it's a good thing, for example, that we have international regulations for shipping or air traffic. that we have international telephone codes, that we all observe time zones, all this kind of thing. This is all these things are good for the smooth running of the world.
Yes.
I think where it becomes problematical is where you go into a country and try to impose a Western industrialist model of development on a country.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so it was more of your feeling, and I suppose you were more looking at, you know, countries in Africa, Asia, and thinking along those lines. Because I'm also thinking about at that time with Eastern Europe, you know, moving into capitalism, and then the breakup of Yugoslavia, and whether if that had any part in it at all.
Yes, somewhat. Yes, I mean, I feel that what happened, the transition from communism to capitalism was rather badly handled. I mean, especially in a country like East Germany. After the reunification of Germany, it was very badly handled, with Western firms going in there into East Germany, buying up East German companies and stripping the assets and closing them down, and social services declined. There was mass emigration from the East, and not that the East German regime was an ideal one, but there were certain good things about it. And I don't think it was right just to go in there and steamroller.
I mean, when you look at the stats, I mean, like, I'm not that familiar with all the East German countries, but I mean the Eastern European countries. But certainly, if you take, you know, the Soviet Union, Russia, let's say if you take Russia, life expectancy went down, especially for male, like down to the 50s. I mean, it was, I mean, the natural resources were totally out of control. It went from a superpower, you know, rivaling the United States, and obviously with a whole bunch of problems or whatever, but the United States had this in its sight, to being basically a third world country, you know, with, and so, I mean, we can understand the rise of Putin within that context. He brought Russia back from, you know, from that degradation that happened under Yeltsin, and the stripping of the assets and so forth. You know, and I think a lot of Western commentators have no sympathy whatsoever.
No, they don't. They don't understand the real situation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so right. So I mean, I can see all those things contributing to your disillusionment. Was leaving really just a matter of your contract ending, or was it some sort of dramatic event?
No, it was simply that my salary there was dependent on a particular budget, and eventually the budget was exhausted, and so my job wasn't renewed.
Right.
By that time, I was getting a bit homesick for Europe anyway, so I went back to England.
Yes.
And then very soon I got the job with UNESCO in Germany, in Hamburg.
So you were based where, if you said you were homesick for Europe?
Yeah, well, basically London.
So you were based, okay, so when you say Europe, you meant the continent. I wasn't sure if it was New York or somewhere else, but London.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and because you had been living in Germany for a while before, is that it?
No, I moved to Germany a very short time after I moved back to England from New York. Mm-hmm. I was only about 6 months in London, and then I got the job with UNESCO in Hamburg. So I've been in Germany now for about 25 years.
Well, let me explore this, because you were born in Edinburgh, is it?
No, I was born in southeast England, in Kent.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
Okay. But your
but,
family is Scottish
uh,
background.
well, my father is of Scottish extraction, but he came from the north of England,
Right.
and my mother was American.
Oh, your mother's American. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So I was born in Kent, but then I grew up largely in Edinburgh.
Right. So here's an irony I'm seeing. I'm seeing
Yes,
that. So here's your Scottish background,
yeah,
born south of England. Your mother's American, but you're feeling
yeah.
homesick for the continent. And is that a sort of a global thing, or how do you explain that?
Well, when I was living in the States, being away from Europe, and looking back across the Atlantic, in a funny sort of way, it made me realize that I'm a North European.
Right.
And so
Could you
my,
tell me what about being in New York made you realize you were North? Because this is fascinating to me because it's very parallel to my own experience. So
oh, really?
yeah.
Yes, yes.
What
Well,
made you feel that you were not American, you were North European?
well, uh, a crucial experience was I, well, my then wife was Jewish, and we used to attend a synagogue near where we lived. And one evening, I was attending a lecture by a rabbi, and he was talking about the difference between monotheism and polytheism, monotheistic religions and the pagan religions. And he said, well, the difference is that in monotheism, history moves in a straight line. It all goes forward continually to the promised land or the second coming, or some other infinitely receding goal.
Correct.
Whereas he said in polytheism, everything goes in a great circle.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I realized that I preferred the circle to the straight line.
Yeah.
So I realized that I was a pagan.
Right.
And somehow, so I think that was the beginning of that. That was the moment when I realized that would be my path.
Right.
And having decided that path, as I said, paganism is something that's rooted in a particular region, particular place.
Yeah.
And my particular place was Northern Europe. And I've had a fairly sort of cosmopolitan upbringing, traveled around quite a bit around Europe. Yeah. So, and I learnt French and German at a fairly early age. So I think I've tended to identify myself as a European.
Right. Now, when you say Northern European, would you even go even more specific to say, I don't know, Celtic or Teutonic, or would you go that specific, or not really? You'd just say Northern.
Well,
what people would that encompass?
Well, I'm basically by ancestry, I'm partly Celtic and partly Germanic.
Right.
So I'm attracted by both of those traditions, both of those mythologies. But what appeals to me about the Germanic tradition is that there's some continuity. You see, we have, for example, the Edda, which is the collection of Old Norse poems and accounts of the old mythology, the old gods. Yeah. And we have the sagas. We have
these are the Icelandic.
Yes, the Icelandic sagas. Yes. We have,
etc.
Yeah, and we have archaeological sites, folklore, folk traditions, and all of that. So there's a certain continuity there. which you don't have to quite the same extent in the Celtic tradition.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's correct. That's correct. I would agree with that. Now, but so what alienated you from what about that insight alienated you from America?
Well, I wasn't alienated from America.
Well, maybe that's the wrong word, but made you realize that you are not American. There are people like, I don't know if you've read Carolyn Merchant. Very interesting stuff. She is a sort of historian and ecologist, and she's looked at colonial America and looked at the survival of pagan traditions in colonial America. So you know the Farmer's Almanac?
I've heard of it, yes.
Right. It's very, very important in the United States. And it's just totally pagan. It's all about the sun and the moon and the stars and what day to plant and whatnot and remedies and all these sorts of things. And these are so important to the farmers of the United States, you know, and these were brought over, obviously, you know, from so it's very interesting. She sort of has uncovered, and you know, every day in the United States, you know, there's the horoscope section that everybody reads, you know, and they may not have the deep understanding of the horoscope astrology thing, and they just sort of take it as the superficial thing in the newspaper. But so I was just wondering, so what sort of pushed you a little more that you are not American?
It's hard to say. Well, let me put it this way. In Europe, there's a sense that there's a sense of a kind of basis of civilization, of culture, that is like a kind of background music.
Correct.
And it's there the whole time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, in the building, just in the environment.
Yes, there's an interesting book by Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. I don't know if you know that.
Love that book. One of my favorites of all time.
Yes. Well, he relates an interesting anecdote in that book where he was in a restaurant in Paris, and he heard one waiter talking to another and calling him a Cartesian. You're a Cartesian. But by which he meant, you know, you're obviously someone who thinks logically and clearly and systematically. You know. But the point was that even a waiter would understand what the word Cartesian meant. You see.
Yes.
Presupposed a certain knowledge, certain basic cultural knowledge, which wouldn't be the case in America. You see, you couldn't assume in America. Right. Yeah.
Only a highly educated and very often, you know, pretentious, affecting sort of people would be using those terms in America.
Yes.
Even the people that knew it, you're not sure you want to hang around them.
Right. Yes.
Yes, you know, I totally understand. Yeah, I mean, and the sense of time is totally different in in America,
absolutely.
and you know, 100 years ago is ancient in America, whereas 100 years ago is within reach. I mean, you can touch it. It's just like, and when you go to Asia, you know, 2,000 years ago is just the other day. Whereas it is unfathomable in America because Columbus only went to that side 500 years ago. So, so that whole sense of time and grounding is extremely different when you're in those different stages.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, it sounds to me that you sort of had, and very similar to me, it was a sense of self-awareness that was rooted in one's history and ancestry and culture and tradition. And these things are sort of lost in America. I get this sort of weird feeling that the Atlantic Ocean is like some memory hole, right? So, or some memory vacuum. And when people cross it from wherever in Asia or Europe or wherever, and they go to America, it's like they forget everything. And it's like, although they may be one generation removed, but it's like that's like gone and forgotten, and everything has to be new, and it's you know, and everything old is bad, and it's a totally different ethos on that.
Although New York, in some ways, is an exception to that.
Absolutely. New York is a European city, Manhattan in particular. It's not really American, I think.
No, you can say that, yes.
Yes, I totally agree. So, I mean, one of this thing I think that would come with this sort of sense of self-awareness and time and ancestry and all this sort of stuff, I think it carries with itself a critique of materialism.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I would, yes.
And do you think paganism itself or the examination of paganism as a critique of materialism?
Well, I think partly, yes. Yes, especially if you take the domain of the environment. As I said, it's often pagans who espouse environmental causes against economic interests.
Yeah.
And
now, interesting. I'd like to interject something here.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the Catholic Church would make the exact opposite argument. And but I think they're coming from the same place, but it's the terminology and what you conceive of as paganism, because they would say that worship of mammon is pagan, right? And so the worship of wealth is pagan, because they're associating it with the Roman Empire and decadence and so forth. You see, but because they say that all the time, that that the worship of wealth is a pagan thing, and so it's a very interesting, and you're looking at it from another angle.
Yes. Well, I mean, a typical example of an environmental issue here in Germany is the case of the Hambach forest near Cologne. This is one of the few remaining areas of primeval forest in Europe. And it's being threatened by an energy company that wants to destroy the forest to do open cast mining, coal mining. And there's been a huge protest with hundreds of people gathering in the forest to keep out the bulldozers. And many of these protesters are pagan.
Right. Yeah.
So yes, I would say that there is a critique of materialism involved in.
And this takes us to the Romantic movement and Friedrich Nietzsche in particular, who I just admire tremendously. And I mean, he had a huge critique of Christianity. I mean, it's shocking to read even today for people.
Yeah.
If you read the Antichrist, or if you read the Genealogy of Morals, I'm sure it would shock people even today, that it's so powerful and so deep. And he essentially embodied this kind of critique of materialism in a sense, and it's interesting the way that I suppose this and Alan Bloom is Jewish, and although he respects the Greek pagan tradition quite a bit, but it and the commonality with the Catholic Church I was speaking about before, it all comes down to an understanding and respect for the soul.
Yes, absolutely.
And when you do not have this understanding and respect for the soul, all you have is material things and this life and gadgets.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the Kingdom of Bhutan from 1972. They started this. I don't know if they started it, but they definitely championed it, and they still do it today. Something called the Gross National Happiness Index, because they were as I believe they're Hindu, right? I'm not sure if it's Buddhist. I think it's Hindu. They're a Hindu kingdom. I could be wrong, but Hinduism and Buddhism are from the same root, ultimately, anyways. But so they were criticizing gross GDP and GNP, economic output per capita, and that as your standard of living. When you were working with the UNDP, did you come across that gross national happiness index at all as a sort of critique?
No, I didn't. I've read about it since.
Right.
And I think it's great. What I like about it is, as you say, it takes into account things like local traditions and cultural heritage and religion and sense of identity and so on. It's interesting to contrast that with the Human Development Index of the UNDP, which was started when I was working there.
Right. Yeah. I remember that when it was coming out, because we were, even from our end, I mean, we had some people who were also working with the UN at our university, and we were sort of making interventions into that. Because, human development is supposed to be more than just the economic numbers. Yeah.
Well, yes, but still, it's measured according to things like, basically according to things like per capita income, life expectancy, literacy, level of education,
health. Yeah.
Yes, all those things. I mean, that's all very well, but if you take a community like the Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert in Africa, if you were to measure them by the standards of the Human Development Report, they wouldn't even get a rating.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they live in absolute poverty. They only live on what they can hunt and gather. They have very low life expectancy. They're illiterate, and yet they have a marvelous culture, a rich oral tradition going back many generations, and a musical tradition, and a very highly developed set of customs and social conventions. Now, if you take a Kalahari Bushman and put him in a modern house with running water and give him a regular job, in a very short time, he's going to become severely depressed.
Yeah.
Because by taking him away from his traditional tribal grounds, you've in effect taken away his soul.
Yeah. I'm sure you're used to this from working in the UNDP context, because when arguments are presented like that to people in these fora, they would say, listen, you're romanticizing poverty.
Exactly.
You're romanticizing a life expectancy of 45 years old, and people who are chronically starving, and in fact you're keeping them poor. Interestingly, these are like liberal, ultra liberals, sometimes ultra capitalists who would say that. And who has the exact same argument, like the communist Chinese, for example, with Tibet, right? And the communists in the Soviet Union would talk about the backward traditions of the Central Asian people, and that the task of socialism was to bring up their material standard of living. And so it's interesting that capitalism and communism both they were competing on this in the same terms. Who could deliver greater material goods to people? And a lot of the Cold War, especially in the earlier days, it was centering on that. Who could go to space first? Who could provide the most consumer goods? Capitalism won in that. There's no doubt. But the rules of the game and the terms of the game, was not critiqued by those two. They were just saying who could provide these better.
Both materialists, but in different ways.
Yeah. So what's your answer to those people who say, listen, you're just romanticizing poverty. It's bunk. You would never go and live out in the desert with a life expectancy of 45 years old, and you not sure where your next meal is coming from. You have no vaccine. What's your response to that?
Well, my response is, of course, I wouldn't, because I come from a different background and I'm used to a different way of life.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. exactly.
Mm.
Exactly. No, it's, you know, this is the thing, you know, and that takes us to the globalism, universalism thing too, because they think there's a universal standard to happiness that everybody,
Yes, yes.
and this takes me, you know, to my own thing, my own crisis, let's say, which is very similar to yours. It was like, well, does the whole world really, you know, want to become like America? You know, is that the vision for the world? And the further you away, the further away from America you are, the less developed you are, and the closer to America, then the more developed. You know, I grew up in Canada. I spent the first 20 years of my life there, and you know, the Native Americans, you know, have a, you know, presence there. Not in Toronto where I lived, hardly. You know, you could live your whole life and not know that they were around, except if you read the news sometimes, and there might be something or some standoff at some point, which happened a few times. But you know, you look at the civil rights struggle, you look at these sort of, so let me take, you know, the 80s when I was a young student getting into these things, and you know, you have the Sandinistas and the, you know, the FMLN in El Salvador. So you had, you know, a socialist struggle, and you had a sort of black struggle, and these sorts of things, which you know, as a sort of politically minded, I was very much in the left wing in as a young person on those days. You know, I could understand that, I could sympathize that, I could get with that. And then, you know, and I used to see the Native Americans in Canada and stuff protesting, and I was like, you know, really, what's your problem? I mean, Canada, you know, you can just leave the reservation, and there's no discrimination against Native people at all. You could just, you know, just like an immigrant that comes from another country, and which would describe my family, right? Coming from another country, and you just integrate, and you partake in everything that Western society has to offer. What's your problem? Why are you on the reservation if it's so poor? Just come and live in the city. And I didn't understand it growing up so much. And it's when, for me, it was a Malcolm X moment, right? It was getting into Malcolm X and then seeing how sort of how colonized I was mentally into accepting these very things I'm critiquing now, that, you know, that America is the standard of development, and that's what we should all aspire to, and and this sort of thing. And then I realized how much of my own past I've looked down upon. I've tried to excise from myself that that I tried to be. You know, I know they're well-meaning and saying that, yes, you can be part of the society, but what that means is that, you know, I have to pretend to be white, and I should not, you know, be what my ancestry is, religiously or ethnically or culturally or whatever, and it means abandoning your own heritage. And then and when I got into that, and then I understood the Native Americans. I said, now I understand that you guys can't be bought. That all those trinkets aren't enough for you. You're looking for something else. You're not looking for more money and more, you know, a new iPhone. You know, that's not what you're looking for. And so to me, all of that, you know, it's all tied together. You know, so to me, paganism is naturally, you know, tied into that, because to me, and then when I started to read Nietzsche and stuff like that, because I thought from a Malcolm X perspective that Christianity was this European imposition, and then I realized, wait, but even Europe had a pre-Christian tradition that itself was imposed, and many people in Europe, such as Nietzsche, strongly against what that Christian ethos did to Europe and so forth. The whole German Romantic movement. So for me, that's how I sort of understood it. Now, so this is someone from the outside. So I'm very interested in talking to you about these issues, because, you know, did you have these similar kind of feelings for yourself?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yes. Well, can you describe some of them for me then?
some of my feelings about being pagan.
Yeah, yes, and sort of, I don't know, was there an epiphany moment? You described one being in the synagogue and the
Yes, yes.
linear history and circular. You realize that you're not so much into the linear thing. But were there any sort of other epiphanies that were important to you?
Yes, yes. I sort of, it's been a rather long and roundabout journey for me.
You're right.
I got, as I said, I began to be interested in esoteric things in my 20s and began to write books about it. And then I began to move in esoteric circles in and around London.
Right.
And in those circles, I had some friends who were into paganism. So I became vaguely interested in things like the runes and the neo-witchcraft movement, Wicca, and things like that. But I didn't at that time really think of it as a path for me.
Right.
I think I thought, well, that's sort of, these are folk traditions. You know, what I'm interested in is the sort of higher intellectual type of esotericism.
Okay.
But I had some very, very good friends. One old friend of mine who's had a big influence in my life is Hilmar Byrne Hilmarsson, who's head of the pagan community in Iceland. Mm-hmm. And so I gradually became more and more interested in these pagan traditions. And the key moment was after I moved to Germany. I was at the Frankfurt Book Fair. I was walking through the Frankfurt Book Fair and met an old friend from London days, Frederick Lamond, who had written a book called Religion Without Beliefs, about his own particular pagan path. He was in the Wicca movement. And this was a book describing his path to paganism and what his form of paganism is all about. And I found this book very convincing. And I read it on the train going back to Hamburg. And that caused me to think that this was my path.
Right, right. It's interesting you mentioned that. Sorry, did you want to finish?
Well, then, after I got back to Hamburg, I called him and I said, well, I think that the pagan path is the path for me. So what should I do next? So then he advised me to found a pub moot in Hamburg where a group of people got together every so often, like-minded people, and discussed paganism and pagan issues and so on. And through that, I started to celebrate with various members of that group, and so gradually I became more and more active.
Interesting. You know, there's an interesting point you mentioned there that resonated with me. You talked about when you were looking at the pagan tradition and you thought it was too folk and you wanted to get into the more intellectual aspects, you know, and I totally understand that, because there's a great intellectual tradition that goes to the Renaissance and the Hermetic traditions and all that. And it's, for me, getting back into Hinduism from being raised a Catholic, and my mother's side is Hindu. My father's side converted to Christianity generations back, and to Catholicism. But one of the things, and then also being, you know, educated, intellectual, etc., etc. You know, the superstitions of Hinduism were embarrassing. It was shameful. It was, you know, something you didn't want to identify with at all as a thinking person, and so forth. But my attitude towards that has changed entirely. You know, I mean, and instead I want to go towards a more philosophical aspects. You know, the very high philosophy of Hindu Hinduism, Advaita philosophy, all these things, non-dualism, all this sort of high stuff that people write tons of books about, and so I was into that. But I've embraced that so-called superstition very warmly now.
Oh, yes, I can understand that.
Yes, and is it the same with you?
Yes. I
Right.
think we followed very similar paths.
Yes. Why? So what broke your resistance to that foolish superstition for you?
Well, just I can hear some background noise.
Yeah, sorry, that's an announcement coming through my area.
Right.
Yes.
I think it was the realization that there's more to life than intellectual pursuits. Well, let me put it this way. I think to be a fully satisfied human being, you need something for the head, something for the heart, and something for the belly.
Absolutely.
The high intellectual tradition gives you something for the head, but you need also something for the heart and the belly, and this is what some form of ritual practice gives you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is absolutely true, because the sort of overly intellectual thing can never sustain you. It can never sustain.
No, that's right. Yeah. That's right.
And another thing in Hinduism, I realize that a lot of those rituals and symbolism, when you understand what that is, in fact, it is more philosophically satisfying than some written prose. I think Schopenhauer said that about music. He said a symphony can be more philosophically profound than any written work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
There is a non-verbal intelligence and a very high sophisticated intelligence in these things.
Oh yes, indeed.
Yes. So I agree with that. So let me ask you about the implications of your pagan beliefs or pagan beliefs in general, only your. But do you think that paganism, well, does your brand of paganism, because there are many brands, does yours imply any sort of politics? It sounds like it sort of does with the feminism and ecology type of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think I think pagans cover the whole political spectrum. I don't think it covers many different belief systems and political points of view. So I don't think you can say that paganism in general represents any particular political.
But how about your personal brand of paganism? Would you say it puts you anywhere on the political spectrum?
Well, let me see. How would I describe my political position? I've been to some extent involved in local politics in Hamburg, and so I believe it's important to engage at a local level in some way. At the moment, as you know, we're going through a crisis with the Brexit.
Yeah.
I'm from Britain, but I live in Germany, and I now have German citizenship.
Right.
And my position on the Brexit was I was initially in favour of it, but I now think that it would have been perhaps more sensible for Britain to stay in the European Union and try to reform it.
Well, what about Scottish independence? What's your opinion on that?
Scottish independence. I'm sort of ambivalent about it. I can understand the Scottish nationalist position, but I think it would be a pity if the United Kingdom were to break up.
Right.
So I think that the best solution really is to have a kind of federal system, which is more or less what they've got at the moment. So, I mean, they have their own parliament.
Yeah. You have the Welsh Regional Assembly. And then, you know, and the English are saying, well, look, where's the English Parliament?
Yeah,
You have a British Parliament, but where's the English Parliament?
Exactly, yes, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I was going to say regarding my political position, you see, I would argue that the terms left and right are rather useless categories.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah, because for one thing, they mean very different things in different contexts.
Yeah.
For example, in America, being right-wing usually means being in favor of laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas in Europe, if you're on the so-called right, you may well be anti-capitalist.
Absolutely. And people in the United States don't understand that. The
Yeah,
anti-capitalist conservative tradition. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes, yes. So you have to look at each political issue on its own. And yeah, I mean, to take the environmental issue again, most of my pagan friends would stand up for the environment against commercial interests, as in the case of the Hambach forest. But on other political issues, as I said, you find a very wide spectrum of positions.
Yeah, I mean, myself, I hold positions that might be considered extreme left, extreme right, and centrist, and mainstream left and mainstream right. You know, and I think, you know, the whole way they categorize these things, like for instance, I think for a proper socialist system to work, you have to be sort of xenophobic in a way, because you have to have fairly homogeneous, stable communities. Because if people are going to be sacrificing their income for others, there has to be some sort of human relationship where it's acceptable for you to have to pay these high taxes and give up your personal income for your neighbor. But when it's people who are passing through, who might be here for 5 years, then go off to another place for 5 years, or people who are, let's say, you know, freeloading, and they have no moral shame in it because they are not part of the community. Whereas if you are really part of a community, you would feel some sort of shame because you have a human relationship with people. So ironically, you know, it's like where socialism has kind of worked, let's say in Scandinavia, it's because they were homogenous. You know, they were homogenous communities, and they could take the sacrifice because of non-material bonds that they had. You know, yes. Not just transactional. And so, you know, but a lot of these sort of the contemporary left, at least, you know, is for communism and open borders. It doesn't make sense. It can't be sustainable, you know.
No.
Yes, you know, so it's so a lot of these sort of positions, but I think, and a lot of the kind of paganism has been tied up into New Ageism, and it's
New Ageism, yes,
and it's been very, very much in the popular mind, at least, tied to the left, right? So ecology, people chaining themselves to trees, and people into free love and sex. And all this sort of thing. I don't know. Did you ever see that movie, The Wicker Man?
Oh yeah.
I think it's a brilliant movie. It's an argument against paganism in a sense, but I think it's done really well. It's probably the best pro-Christian message. I think underlying it is a pro-Christian message. You know, but. It was very. I think it's an excellent thing. I mean, for listeners who don't know, it's about somebody investigating a murder in a remote northern Scottish island. In that island, and this is in the late 60s, and in that island, people have adopted also the pagan traditions and going around the Mayflower and doing home remedies or putting frogs in your throat. All these sort of old wives' tales and stuff like that have become real and institutionalized, and the free attitude to sex and all the things that we were being advocated by the hippies and so forth. And then at the end, it has a very horrific thing where they wanted to sacrifice him in a human sacrifice, and it's like, whoops, we didn't think this thing through, did we? And that's sort of like, it's very interesting looking at not romanticizing the old pagan traditions, and you know. So, but and so a lot of times when people take up paganism, they're picking and choosing, and they're taking this and that, true. and so they come up with this sort of artificially leftist interpretation, perhaps, if you want to say. But really, when you take the whole gamut, it's a very complex sort of thing, because the localism puts you against this globalism. Wouldn't you? Would you agree?
Yes, yes. But I think it's possible it's possible to have a sort of middle way. Yeah. You see, I think the European Union could offer quite a good compromise between those two things. Not as it's presently constituted, because I think it's become a top-heavy bureaucracy. But I think if it were reformed, it could be quite a good model. In the European Union, there's this principle of subsidiarity, which means that decisions should be taken at the lowest possible level, the most regional possible level, which is a good principle. It doesn't always get applied.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it ever happened in Europe. Everything is just regulated from Brussels, it seems.
Yeah, that I think should be changed. But there are certain good things. For example, there's in the European Union, local languages are promoted. So languages like Welsh, Scottish Gaelic, and North German, Plattdeutsch, Low German. And you can, if you're the speaker of one of these languages, you can demand an official document in the language.
Right.
In that language.
Yeah, it was a curious thing that sort of this regionalism promoted sub-national identities in a way that national governments did not. Yeah. Yes,
that's right. So I think if one could combine those two things, it would be good. If you could have a sort of a loose international system which respects local traditions.
Yes, and then this thing, I mean, starts to push on some touchy issues. Like, for instance, should Turkey be part of the EU, right? And if you're going for this sort of communitarian vision, I mean, it's perfectly valid to say no, Turkey should not be part of the EU because it is a different tradition. And then other people say, well, that's racist. And this is where I think paganism, puts one in the contemporary configuration of things. What people would say is right wing. But certainly people who consider themselves far right certainly do hark back to the old pagan traditions, and so like Mussolini, the whole thing about fascism, fasces, is back to the Roman Empire. Those are the Roman soldiers, and they looked at the pride of the Roman Empire, and they brought back the Greek art and the Roman art, and they hated the degeneracy of modern art, and looked to classical Greco-Roman, which is pagan, high pagan, traditions.
But on the other hand, if you look at Icelandic paganism, you see this is based on the old Nordic society, which was very democratic. In fact, they had one of the earliest democracies in the world. Where they used to meet at what's called the Thingvellir, which is...
although the Vikings didn't have the warmest of reputations.
Well, no, they didn't. they've been somewhat unfairly portrayed, I think. But yes, in Iceland they had a very democratic system where they used to meet at this parliamentary assembly place, which is it's in a very dramatic location in Iceland where the two continental plates meet, and there's cliffs on either side, and it opens out. And there they used to meet, and all the decisions were taken collectively by the community, and everyone had the opportunity to
yes. And so this is an interesting thing about paganism, and why I think, just like left and right, almost it needs to be refined more, because it takes into account, you know, these radical local sort of democracies. This sort of it also takes into account the Roman Empire, the Babylonian Empire, Hinduism. You know, it takes into account nationalist movement, racialist movements were very much based on it as well. Anti-modernist movements, scientific movements. The Renaissance was very much based on rediscovery of the Greco-Roman tradition. It's a huge swathe of things that that can be also Luddite from one end to, you know, Da Vincian, you know, futuristic visionary on the other end. And I mean, the way I have sort of I've taken this from Camille Paglia when she's talking about high paganism and low paganism. You know, so the high paganism would be sort of the imperial, let's say, you could say Egyptian or Babylonian and Greek and Roman, and then you have the sort of folk, the heathen, heath, you know, the you know, if materially more primitive, you could say, types, you know, not necessarily imperialist, and they are, you know, on the lower end, and you know, and you see this in all sorts of pagan tradition, the high and the low. Even like say within Hinduism, you have the high kingdoms and all these things, and then you have all these village traditions and village gods and all these things, and you'll see this all over the place in Buddhism and whatnot. Do you find that distinction useful?
Well, absolutely, yes. I mean, you could say that low paganism is like your local cunning man or woman making a spell for a farmer to ensure a good harvest, or making a talisman for a woman who wants to get pregnant. Whereas the high paganism would be, for example, the kind of paganism that you get in Iceland with impressive ceremonies for various different occasions, and where to become a priest or a godi, you have to have a knowledge of Old Norse
I suppose literacy is a big part of it now that I think about it. And high paganism is probably based on literacy and you know, books and writing and whereas low paganism is oral, it's folk, passed down.
Generally speaking, that would be true.
I think so. You know, and Paglia, and I'm sure she's not original in this, but it's just that she's the one that introduced me to it. You know, talking about the transition from the earth god to the sky god. You know, and you know, and that's kind of one of the things between the low and the high.
Absolutely, yes.
So so I mean, in what ways, I guess to some of this political aspect part, you know, I mean, in what ways do you think your writing is relevant to this, to these kind of political ideas, or is it sort of more a kind of niche thing separate from these contemporary political issues that we've been talking about on the podcast?
Well, my writing is not directly concerned with political issues. Most of my recent writing has been connected with pagan themes in one way or another. For example, my short story, or short novella, you could say, Master of the Starlit Grove, which is in a collection of the same name, puts forward the idea that there's a sort of pagan egregore, a sort of collective thought form in the etheric realm, which was created at the time of Christianization as a sort of ark to preserve paganism until the time was right for it to re-emerge, which it's now doing. Well, this is fantasy, of course, but this is the idea that I put across in the story. And I also wrote a spy thriller called The Lebensborn Spy. This also has a pagan touch because there's a particular figure from Nordic mythology who appears in the story at certain critical moments. The Lebensborn Spy, actually, now that I think of it, it does have a political element, because the story concerns, well, one of the characters in it is a young man of Danish origin, who was the son of a Danish woman and a German soldier during the war, and was given in adoption. And after the war, he ends up in East Germany, and he's having a conversation with his wife, who's a dedicated communist, and trying to explain to her why he feels a longing for his Danish roots to go back to the land of his mother and reconnect with his soil and his roots and so on. And she says to him, oh, that's all a lot of bourgeois reactionary nonsense, all that stuff about roots and family and tradition and so on. One day there'll be no more national boundaries and no more silly little countries like Denmark, and we'll all be speaking the same language. And he says, well, that's not the kind of world I would want to live in. So the book, the message of the book, has partly to do with this kind of themes we've been talking about.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I again have to just point out your character who talked about family and tradition, etc., being bourgeois, which is commonly said, but that's by people who don't understand what the term bourgeois means, because in proper Marxism, right, destruction of the family is bourgeois, because the bourgeois are the capitalists. Right. And the capitalists are the ones who destroy the old traditions, because and Marx applauded that about capitalism. Right. Capitalism was supposed to wipe away the aristocracy, all the old distinctions. Capitalism was to do that job, and then socialism was to just complete the job of So people are saying that that's bourgeois, when actually the bourgeois thing is abolishing the national borders, abolishing the national identities in order for capitalism, because then we'd all be perfect consumers. Right?
Absolutely.
Right, because we wouldn't have any non-material attachments, and all we'd be interested in is what the next iPhone is and what the next Marvel Comics movie is, and etc.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
That's right. So a couple of another thing I wanted to bring up is that in your personal journey, let's say, from the out of the UNDP thing, I know that wasn't central to your life, but it's very interesting for me to look at, especially in my own trajectory and in the context of the podcast. But when I started to get into all this development stuff and international politics, I kind of adopted the sort of white hippie sort of attitude. I don't know if hippie is even the right word, but save the world kind of thing. Where we go out and save others, and then people. So a lot of these white Europeans would then sort of like adopt, when they started to critique the evil of the Western world, let's say, which is their own society, then they would start to adopt some El Salvador native wear and have some beads and purse and all this kind of stuff, or some Thai thing here, or some Buddhist thing there, or whatever. And but it still was all exotic. It was very exotic and about the other, and it was always about doing something for someone else. And I found it as as inauthentic as imperialism, right? It was just a different type, and the whole thing about developing the other countries is definitely related to Christian missionary work. Whereas before they were saving souls, now they're saving economies, right? But it's the same sort of thing with this one vision, saving souls to accept the one God, and now it's sort of saving the economy to accept the American capitalist way or whatever. And what I find intriguing about yours and what I identify with is that you're not looking to be a Buddhist. You're not looking to be some Native American shaman, or you are looking at your own ancestral traditions, and I think that makes your journey qualitatively different from a lot of the other critics. Do you have anything to comment on that?
Well, what you were saying about the development effort being a sort of continuation of the Christian missionary work, I think it also has something to do with this linear thinking that I was talking about earlier. That in the Christian view, the Christian view also involves this idea of a linear progress of history. That you're always progressing forward, and so it's the same in development. There we are.
Right.
Yes, you're always continually progressing, continually becoming more and more advanced technologically and so on, towards some infinitely receding goal. And this linear thinking has become transferred to other realms. You see, it's been transferred to the artistic realm. So that the artistic realm, so that you can't refer back to tradition. You have to always be doing something new and provocative and forward-looking.
That's right.
Yeah, the same in architecture. That you can't be inspired by classical architectural forms. You always have to do something new.
Yeah.
And, that is in fact the easiest way to make something old-fashioned. If you create something new today, in a few years' time, it's going to look dated.
And it's disorienting. It disorients people.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And that's the case with the modern world, and it makes people have no center. They can't deal with their lives, they can't deal with the world, and they just trudge on. And so in a way you have that with this forever going forward, but in a curious way, it in people's daily lives it just becomes a circular thing, because it's just you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, and it's meaningless, and people live this sort of because in the end material things are meaningless, and lives without meaning. And so and I think to me it seems your search for paganism and well in the pagan tradition and so forth is part of a search for meaning, which is
absolutely
which is terrible thing about modern life. One final thing about your work, Rosicrucianism, which is the focus of yours. Sorry, that's not considered a pagan tradition, is it?
No, but you see, my journey towards paganism was sort of through my interest in the esoteric traditions.
Correct.
I was never practicing Rosicrucian.
Right.
It was just that during my researches, I kept coming across this term Rosicrucian, and I found that it was rather difficult to find out what exactly it was. There weren't any very good books about it. So, well, to cut a long story short, I decided to write one.
Right.
So,
our first prime minister in Trinidad and Tobago here was a Rosicrucian, and also
yeah.
and lodges, of course, are extremely popular, not only here but all over the world among politically powerful and influential people.
Yes.
And there's a lot of stories about the Illuminati and the New World Order and globalism and all these people and Christians, a lot of Christians who are against globalism and are against the Illuminati, and they kind of associate that with paganism, because I guess they're saying it's non-Christian, it's undermining Christianity. But just to clarify for people who may have that impression, I think you would agree that those are not pagan traditions, the Illuminati.
No.
Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, etc.
No, they have nothing to do with paganism.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of them are drawn from the Old Testament, ultimately.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. Well, in sum, what would you say your main message is that you want to put out to the world in your work?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah.
The main, as I see it, one of the great problems in the modern world is that there are so many people who have no roots, who are uprooted. I mean, obviously, millions of people are literally uprooted as refugees. But even the people who are not refugees don't have much sense of their roots.
Yeah.
In it. So I think my message is, part of my message is find your roots and celebrate your roots. And if possible, through some form of ceremonial practice. There are some lines of W.B. Yeats that I find very beautiful in a poem he wrote called, I think it's called To a Daughter, in which he says, "How but in custom and in ceremony are innocence and beauty born." How but in custom and ceremony are innocence and beauty born. That's something that I try to get across in the stories that I write. Of course, there are, if you're uprooted from your original homeland, then it's difficult for you. Either you can try to reconnect with the roots of your homeland, or you can connect with the roots of your new country.
Yes.
But one way or another, you can find a way of finding some roots, either reconnecting with your own.
That's why I left Canada and North America.
Oh, yes.
Because I needed to connect. I needed to connect. Yes. I needed to be in my place. I needed to. Yeah.
Yes.
And in getting your message out, what has been your biggest challenge?
My biggest challenge? That's another difficult question. I think probably the biggest challenge was simply the practical challenge of finding a way of earning a living.
Right.
And at the same time being able to devote myself to writing and to a life of the mind, which I've somehow managed to do. I mean, I've had periods of being a full-time writer. I've had periods of doing a full-time and quite demanding job. And now I'm retired, so now I have plenty of time to devote to my writing. But yeah, I think that's probably been the biggest practical challenge in my life.
I can sympathize.
Yeah.
Yeah, and have you find the best way to get your message out has been your books, or has it been other things?
My books and my lectures, and I'm also an artist to some extent, working in various media. I recently took up stone carving, and I've been trying to do a similar thing to Ian Hamilton Finlay in creating works that I can integrate in my garden, and some of these have a pagan message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean that whole tradition of gardens, is an ancient one that is mystical, and
it is. Yeah, absolutely, it is.
If you had to do this over, is there anything you would change?
What in my life?
In your life path, let's say, to reach where you are in terms of your message.
Yes, I rather wish that I could have come into contact with paganism much earlier in my life.
Right.
I think if that had happened when I was a child, that I would have developed in a much better way.
Mm-hmm.
I won't go into my whole biography, but when I started on my spiritual search, as it were, I suppose I was about 16, and what strikes me looking back is that for someone looking for an alternative spiritual path, there were very few alternatives available. I mean, apart from Christianity, there was things like theosophy.
Mm-hmm.
There was Buddhism. There was a Buddhist community in Britain, and so the first thing I got interested in was Buddhism.
Yeah.
But that I didn't go very far down that path. But I'd never heard of any, of neo-paganism or Wicca or anything like that. The whole New Age movement and New Age bookshops and so on just didn't exist.
Yeah.
But I think psychologically, it would have been much better for me if I'd been able to become a pagan at that age.
I understand what you mean, because for my son, I've inculcated him in a way that I wish I was. Yeah.
Ah, yes. How old is he?
He's 11 years old.
11. Ah, yes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh, well, that's great.
What would you recommend? What would you recommend to a young person listening to this podcast, facing these issues of living in the modern world now, and with the insights you have? I think it logically follows from what you last said, I would say.
Well, yes. Find your roots and reconnect with them and celebrate them. I think that would.
Yeah.
The difficulty is if you're an immigrant living in some country far away from your roots, then then what do you do?
Yeah.
And of course, in the US, many people are from many different roots in terms of their ancestry. So then you either have to choose one particular branch of your ancestry, or you have to, I don't know, connect with Native American roots or something. But
Yeah.
there's always some way of putting down roots.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And you know, we've been going at this for a long time. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for your body of work, not only your books, but your lectures and stuff, which are available on YouTube. You know, and I've looked at them as well. And I think it's a very, very important message. And you know, in the modern world, it gets demonized. Like a lot of the things that we've come to finding your roots is seen as being racist and stuff, but it's not you know, it is in no way some sort of evil thing at all. And I think you know, I think your discussion here and your work you know, shows the other side to it, which is when it's so demonized. So I want to thank you again for everything you've done.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.